Welcome back, everybody, to the next segment in the history of American V8 engines. Today we are going to delve into Oldsmobile. Oldsmobile is an interesting company and has a pretty in-depth history. It all started with Oldsmobile, with their V8s anyway, in 1949. In 1949, Oldsmobile produced a 303 cubic inch V8 that had a bore of 3.750 and a stroke of 3.437. Now, this was their first attempt at an overhead valve pushrod engine. And it was the Oldsmobiles, the early Oldsmobiles, the Generation 1, was a large engine. It was heavy, it had big cylinder heads, it had a very heavy rigid block, and so it was definitely a very sturdy power plant. However, the early versions were pretty low horsepower, pretty much like all the other manufacturers in the earlier days. The engines were very big and heavy, and they didn't have very good flowing cylinder heads and induction systems. And very often they would put a very tiny, small 1 or 2 barrel carburetor on there, mainly because they wanted fuel efficiency out of these things. They weren't really searching for big power as much as they were reliability and fuel efficiency. 303 cubic inch Oldsmobile had 135 horsepower and 170 foot-pounds of torque, and it was manufactured from 1949 through 1953. Now, the thing about Oldsmobile engines, we're going to work through the years here because Oldsmobile really didn't overlap their engines too much. When one cubic inch configuration went out of production, the following year they went to a different cubic inch engine and they phased out the earlier one. So it's pretty easy when talking about Oldsmobile to work through the years, even though they mixed and matched small blocks and big blocks in there, like we'll find out later. So in 1954, the 303 no longer was produced, and Oldsmobile went to a 324 cubic inch engine, which was basically the 303 with a larger bore. So they took and they bored the cylinders of the 303. It's basically the same engine as the 303. They retained the crank stroke but made the bore larger, increasing the cubic inches to 324. So they went from a 3.750 bore to a 3.875 bore, and of course retained the 3.437 stroke of the 303. The 324 had 170 horsepower and 240 foot-pounds of torque. Now, they did have a performance version of this called the Super 88, and it had 295 horsepower and 350 foot-pounds of torque. Now, what's interesting is this Oldsmobile engine, the 324, was actually shared with GMC trucks, much like some of the Buick engines were. And so in some of the heavy-duty trucks, they offered the Oldsmobile 324 V8 as an option to the inline 6 cylinders because, as you know, GMC and Chevrolet did not have a V8 engine, an overhead valve V8 engine, until 1955. And so in the years previous to 1955, they borrowed some of the V8s from Buick and Oldsmobile, and the 324 was one of them that was an option available in some of the heavy-duty GMC trucks. In 1957, the 324 went away and Oldsmobile introduced the 371 cubic inch engine, which was a taller deck block. It was a 4-inch bore, and it had a new crank stroke of 3-inch 700 thousandths. So they increased the stroke, the deck height, and the bore. The engine was a similar architecture, but it was a larger version. The 371 was also used in GMC trucks, and it was but it was called the 370, even though it was actually a 371. The 371 was the first Oldsmobile to be made available with hydraulic lifters or a hydraulic valve train. It also had one more main cap. It had 5 main caps instead of 4 like the earlier 2 engines. There was more than one version. The base model or version of the 371 produced 240 horsepower and 300 foot-pounds of torque. Now they did have an optional performance version of the 371 that was known as the J2 Golden Rocket. Now all of these engines from the very beginning were called the Oldsmobile Rocket engines, but they also had the Super Rocket and they had the Golden Rocket, which is what the 371 performance version was. The Golden Rocket had 375 horsepower and 400 foot-pounds of torque. And it was actually available with 3 two-barrel carburetors or 3 deuces. And that was also an optional version that was even a higher level of performance, and it produced 380 horsepower and 420 foot-pounds of torque. Although that was a very expensive option, and they really didn't sell too many of those. One of the drawbacks is the way that they set up the 3 two-barrels on the Oldsmobile is under light cruising or just normal everyday acceleration, the middle 2-barrel in the center was the only one that actually was opened up and the other 2 were closed. When you stomped on the throttle and got into it hard, it would open up the front and the rear carburetors. People that didn't drive those cars hard and they just used them as daily drivers, they had a real problem with the front and the rear carburetor just getting built up with carbon and choking out, and a lot of those were actually removed and replaced with a single 4-barrel because of customer complaints. In 1960, the 371 was phased out, and there is an overlap. The next engine that was produced in 1959. So between the years 59 and 60, there was an overlap where they used the 371 and the larger 394. The 394 cubic inch engine was the next in line after the 371. It shared the stroke with the 371, but it had a much larger bore. They took the bore out to 4.125, which increased the cubic inches to 394. This engine was also known as the Starfire 394 or the Skyrocket, depending on what model it was in. In the 64 Starfire, the 394 boasted 345 horsepower and 440 foot-pounds of torque. It was produced from 1959 to 1964, and it was the last version or the largest version of the Generation 1 Oldsmobile engines. Now, there's a couple of V8s that I want to talk about here before we get to the Gen 2 V8. And the first one is the 215 cubic inch all aluminum V8. Now, I did cover this extensively or in more detail in the Buick history video because the 215 all aluminum V8 was actually a Buick engine. What Oldsmobile did, and Pontiac as well, is they adopted the Buick engine. They took Pontiac took the 215 all aluminum Buick V8 and just ran it like it was in a couple of their cars for a couple years. Oldsmobile actually redesigned the cylinder head. They made an aluminum cylinder head of their own that had an extra head bolt for better sealing, and it also had a different look to it. The angle of the valve covers was more in line with the angle of the deck of the block, so it looked more like an Oldsmobile engine. But again, I'm not going to get too much into it because if you want to know more about that, I actually talked quite a bit about that in the Buick history video because it is actually a Buick engine. The other V8 that I think we should throw in here, and this was produced later, is the 5.7 liter diesel. Oldsmobile attempted to make a diesel engine, and we're going to fast forward now a little bit just to touch on this engine because it's really an engine that deserves to be talked about separately from the other gasoline engines. In 1978, Oldsmobile was looking in the face of really stringent regulations from CARB and CAFE. Now, CARB, C-A-R-B, stands for the California Air Research Board. There was another set of standards called the CAFE standards, which was the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Regulations, or CAFE. Now, CAFE was, what they said was, listen, you as a corporation, you as a company, Oldsmobile, you as a division of GM, your car company, your Oldsmobile engines, they have to have an average gas mileage of X amount. It went up to like 27 miles per gallon, which was crazy at the time because everything was getting 12, 13. So they said across all of your engines, you can have some that get 12 or 13, but then you have to have others that get 30 or 35. You have to have an average of 27 miles per gallon. So in order to do this, Oldsmobile said, well, you know what? Diesel's the answer. So they took their existing 350 block and they basically turned it into a diesel. Now they did beef the block up some and they made it a little stronger, but they rushed it into production in 1978 and it had a lot of problems. One of the big issues was they used the same number of head bolts that the gas engine used, and it had major head gasket failures. The other issue with the 5.7 liter diesel, Olds diesel, was that it did not have a fuel water separator system like most diesels, and so water in diesel fuel is deadly to a diesel engine. It destroys, it corrodes the pump. Water's not compressible, it gets into the cylinder and it causes detonation and all kinds of issues. So that was another miss by GM. They decided to skip that because they were rushing it into production to meet these requirements. In fact, there was one engineer that was kind of a whistleblower at Oldsmobile, and he was in on the planning and the engineering of this diesel, and he said, wait, whoa, this thing is not ready to be produced. He says, this is not nearly strong enough. We need a lot more testing. And he basically was forced into early retirement, and Oldsmobile produced the 5.7 liter diesel anyway in 1978. Well, that was a mistake because the engine was a dismal failure, at least at first. What they did is they basically produced it, sold it to the public, and said the public is going to be our guinea pigs. Whatever goes wrong with it, then we'll fix it. The problem is the problems were very far-reaching and pretty disastrous. In fact, a lot of the diesel engines, the earlier 5.7s, were actually swapped out for gasoline engines. When the customer came in, they had so many problems with head gaskets, head bolts breaking, diesel fuel detonation from water in the diesel fuel, all kinds of issues with that engine, injector pump issues, fuel system issues. And so many of those that had these catastrophic problems, GM just said, okay, you know what, we're going to replace it with a gasoline 350 Olds and down the road you go. Well, that was kind of cheating because technically they sold that with a certain gas mileage rating which satisfied the corporate average fuel mileage, but then later they swapped in a gasoline Olds 350, but that didn't count because the CAFE people regulations were only looking at new car sales. So they kind of skirted that issue by swapping out that engine. Even so, it was a giant pain in the hind end for customers, and Oldsmobile got a really, really bad reputation. Not only that, diesel engines got a really bad reputation, which, if you know anything about a well-built diesel, diesels are phenomenal engines, but the reputation of the diesel was actually hurt for decades by what Oldsmobile did. The other aspect of the Oldsmobile 5.7 liter is it was really weak. It had low horsepower and very poor acceleration because it was naturally aspirated. Well, if you know anything about diesel engines, you know that they have to have a turbocharger in order to be efficient and powerful. They decided to save money and to rush the thing in production. Now, we don't need a turbocharger. We'll make a naturally aspirated diesel, which was a huge mistake because it was horribly underpowered. It was very noisy and it blew a lot of black smoke out. And it was just, now the caveat to the 350 Oldsmobile diesel is this. In the later years, they actually fixed all these problems, and they had a pretty decent engine. It was still underpowered and it was still a little noisy, but it really didn't have any of the problems. Unfortunately, the damage to the reputation was already done and nobody bought the thing. What's interesting is my grandfather, when I was young, he bought a 1984 Buick Riviera that had a 5.7 diesel in it. And that was the second to the last year of production where they had fixed all the problems. And that was actually a phenomenally good running engine. He put 160, 170,000 miles that were trouble-free on that engine and really had no problem. They had beefed up the block to the point where it was strong enough. They fixed the head bolt problems and all that. So the only other thing that should have been done is they should have put a turbo on it, but you know, it is what it is. So that was the story of the 5.7 liter diesel, a miserable failure in the history of Oldsmobile. Now, the one thing I would say about the 5.7 diesel, if you're going to build a hot rod engine, if you get a hold of one of those DX blocks, it actually says DX on the block, which was the upgraded version. That is actually a very, very sturdy block that makes a very good high horsepower race engine. That's a fantastic block for building a sturdy power plant. It's a very strong block. I would recommend, if you want to build a hot rod, try to find one of those. All right, so that's the story on the 5.7 diesel and the 215 Buick V8 that they use. Generation 2 started in 1964. From 64 to 67, Oldsmobile had a new style of block and heads, and they started out with a 330 cubic inch. It was a tall deck block, and it was what was known as their big block. They came out, the small blocks came into play a little later with their 350 and some of the other lower cubic inches, but the 330 was the tall deck block. The 330 was known as the Jetfire and had a bore of 3.938 and a stroke of 3.385. Now, this was a different design engine, a newer design as opposed to the Generation 1 that we talked about. The nice thing about the 330s is they all had forged steel crankshafts in them. They had really good connecting rods and a decent piston. It had 320 horsepower and 360 foot-pounds of torque, and it was available across the Oldsmobile lines. The next engine was a 400 cubic inch engine that had a 4-inch bore and a 3.97 stroke. Now, here's the thing about the 400s. 65 to 67 was the first version of the 400, and they actually had another version of the 400 in 68 and 69. It was a 400 cubic inch engine, but it was different. It had a different bore and stroke combination. Why GM did this, why Olds did this, who knows? But there are two different versions of the 400. Now, the first version of the 400 is the better one because it had a forged crankshaft and really good beefy forged rod. The 68 and 69 400 had a smaller bore and a longer stroke and a cast crankshaft and a weaker rod. It was a 3.870 bore and a very long 4.250 stroke, making 400 cubic inches. The 442 version of it had 360 horsepower and 445 foot-pounds of torque. But again, the second version of the 400 was the components internally were not nearly as strong, and it had a smaller bore, which actually hurt the performance capability or potential of that engine. So if you're looking for a 400 Oldsmobile, 65 to 67 is the one you want. Between 65 and 67, they also made a tall deck version of this block that was 425 cubic inches, and it used the same crankshaft as the early 400, which was forged, very strong. So the 425 was a really good crank and rod setup, just like the early 400. It had a bore of 4.125, and the stroke was 3.975, making 425 cubic inches. The 425 had really good flowing heads, very strong bottom end, and it was actually a good builder. It actually made pretty good horsepower even in stock form. The old Super Rocket version of this engine had really good flowing heads on it. It made 360 horsepower and 445 foot-pounds of torque. So it was a very respectable engine, built very strong. Now, they did have a version of the 425 that came out in the Riviera that was what they called the ultra high compression rocket. It actually said ultra high compression on the air cleaner. It was an 11-to-1 engine, and it made 385 horsepower and 450 foot-pounds of torque. And it was only available in the 1968 Toronado. And it was actually called the Toronado Super Rocket engine. Now in 1970, they retained the 425 bore, which was 4.125, or actually it was 4.126 technically. And they increased the stroke of that engine to 4.250, which gave us 455 cubic inches. Now I think it's important to note here that Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick all had a 455 engine. Chevrolet had a 454, which was basically a similar, but these 455s and the one 454 were all different engines, much like all of the 350s from Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Buick. All the 350s were different. In the next video, I'm gonna do Pontiacs next. And in that Pontiac video, I think I'm gonna give a rundown and a comparison of all the 455s and the 454 and all of the 350s, because they were all very different engines with very different bore and stroke combinations. So in the next video, we'll do a comparison of all four of the GM big block engines, and maybe we'll even throw the Cadillac in there, because Cadillac had a 472 and a 500 cubic inch engine. The Hurst Olds had 390 horsepower with the 455 in it and 425 foot-pounds of torque. Now they did make a higher performance version available in the Toronado. It was the Toronado GT W34 package, and it had 400 horsepower and 475 foot-pounds of torque. And they called that the Toronado GT W34. They also had Olds 442 packages with that engine and a Hurst Olds with that package. Now, when you see 442 on the side of the car, that would have been a 4-speed manual transmission, a 4-barrel carburetor, and 2 exhaust pipes or dual exhaust. And it was also a package that was designed to compete with some of the other muscle cars of the era and to appeal to younger buyers who wanted a more sporty performance street rod type engine. So it would have had, of course, a Hurst floor shifter and bucket seats and a sport muscle car type styling. It was definitely something that was appealing to the muscle car crowd. So the 442 455 was actually a very potent, especially in the Cutlass, was really very competitive with the big block Chevelles and the big block Mopars and so forth. So now, unfortunately, the 455, just like the other big blocks, was short-lived. It was basically phased out of production in the mid-70s because of all of the EPA restrictions and the requirements for fuel mileage and so forth. And so in 75, 76, just like all of the other large cubic inch big blocks from the manufacturers just kind of went away, with the exception of Chevrolet. The Chevrolet 454 lived on for many, many years as a truck version or a truck engine, but it wasn't found in any passenger cars after 75, 76. But it definitely was a player in the truck world because they touted it as a heavy duty or truck engine, although it was pretty anemic horsepower wise. We talked about that in the big block Chevrolet history. If you want to go back and look at that, we talk a lot about that. And that brings us to the small block Oldsmobile, which consisted of the 350 cubic inch engine. There were 4 engines in the small block family. The most notable was the 350 cubic inch engine Oldsmobile. They also had a 403 cubic inches, 260 cubic inches, and 307. We're going to talk about all 4 of those. Now, all 4 of these engines externally were physically the same size and pretty much all interchangeable, although there was some caveats to that as well. In 1968, Oldsmobile came out with their 350 cubic inch small block, and it had its run all the way through 1980. Now, the 350 Oldsmobile was unique as far as the GM 350s go, in that it had the largest bore and the shortest stroke of any of the 350s produced by the GM divisions, which made it a very potent engine. It was a big bore, short stroke engine, which, as most of you know, is the configuration that is conducive to having pretty good horsepower potential for any engine. The engine configuration with a larger bore and a shorter stroke is what's known as an over square engine. And a lot of the high performance race engine builders are always trying to, or have a goal of trying to build an engine that's very over square, large bore, short stroke. High revving capability, big bore for lots of air and fuel potential. The performance version of the 350 had 325 horsepower and 360 foot-pounds of torque, and that was found in some of the 442s and the Hurst Olds packages, W30 packages that were available. The 350 had a 4.057 bore and a 3.385 stroke, which is actually the same stroke that all of the small blocks used. The 1968 through 76 350s was a thick, beefy block with a stronger crankshaft. In 77 they went to the lightened up block where they had the main webs in the block that were windowed. They were very thin and it wasn't as strong of a block. It also had a lighter casting cylinder head on it starting in 77 that was more crack prone, and it actually had lower compression and did not flow as well. So when it comes to the 350 Oldsmobile, you want to try to find the 76 or earlier version of that engine, and those have a tendency to be a stronger and a higher performance version of the cylinder heads in block. Oldsmobiles are very easy to identify because right on the front of the engine, the casting number is located just in front of the intake manifold. This will help you identify which 350 or which Oldsmobile engine you're actually looking at. The small blocks can be kind of hard to tell apart. You want to make sure that if you're looking for a 350, you're not getting a 307 or a 260 because, again, they look exactly the same externally. They can be difficult to tell apart, so that casting number is really your ticket. What's interesting is the 350 Oldsmobile was also used in some Cadillacs, and it was also used in some Pontiacs. So you may have found this engine in other GM brands. They borrowed the engine and used it for some of their applications. In 1970, Oldsmobile came out with an interesting car. It was a Cutlass, what they called the Rally 350. It was a Cutlass with a ram air hood. It had a higher performance version of the 350 in it. It had a 4-barrel carburetor. It had a hotter cam. Unfortunately, the Rally 350 Cutlass was only available in one color, which was yellow, and they painted everything yellow and black, even the bumpers. One of the trends in the late 60s, early 70s was a lot of chrome on these muscle cars. And for some reason, Oldsmobile kind of missed this. Because of the gaudy yellow color that this car was, and the fact that they had removed all of the chrome, hurt the sales of this car quite a bit. They didn't sell that many. They only actually produced less than 4,000 of these, and they didn't even sell them all, which is unfortunate because the Rally 350 Cutlass was actually a very good performing car. It was something that wasn't really widely known or discovered. These days they are a very rare car. There's not too many of those left around, but it was actually a really good performing car. It just didn't sell well just because it wasn't appealing to a lot of people. A lot of people actually thought it was kind of ugly. It even had the rims painted the same color as the car, and it just was not something that consumers at the time were looking for. So that was kind of a miss with Oldsmobile. The sad part is if they had put chrome bumpers on this car and a really nice set of chrome wheels, the thing probably would have sold way better than it did and definitely been a more notable muscle car of that era because, again, it was a very good performing car. It just didn't sell well. The Rally 350 in 1970 had 310 horsepower and 390 foot-pounds of torque, which really did a good job of making that car scoot along. So again, those Rally Cutlasses were a pretty quick car. They were pretty fun to drive. I've actually had the privilege of actually taking a ride in one of those. A friend of mine who's a collector actually had one for a short time, and it was definitely a car that would throw you back in the seat when you hit the throttle. Very underrated, very undersold muscle car of the time. In the mid-70s, when the 455 was phased out, it was replaced with a 403 cubic inch. Now the 403 cubic inch small block was basically the same block as the 350 with a much larger bore. This engine actually had the largest bore of any Oldsmobile engine. They cast the block with a 4.351 bore, and of course it retained the 3.385 stroke just like the 350. In fact, the bores were so large on this that the cylinders were Siamese, much like the small block 400 Chevy, but it did have a much larger bore than the Chevy. The 403 was a lightened block. It did have the windowed mains or the weaker main web area, and it was really cast to be a smog era block. It had big open chamber heads that did not flow very well or have very much compression. A very common upgrade for the 403 was to put the early 350 heads on it, which would bump the compression up quite a bit if you got a good set of closed chamber 350 heads. Everything on the 400 was interchangeable externally with the 350, so again it was hard to tell them apart from the 350 without checking the casting numbers. The 403 had 185 horsepower and 320 foot-pounds of torque, so it was a decent engine. Now this 403, what's interesting about this as well, the 403 Olds was used in various Buicks, various Pontiacs, and even a GMC motorhome. So I thought that was pretty interesting. The 77 Toronado with the 403 was actually the first factory production car to have a crank trigger, and it had a rudimentary onboard computer that controlled the crank trigger, and it had some early type sensors, and it had a reluctor wheel. So that was something that Oldsmobile kind of pioneered, and it also used a special distributor and various other sensors to go along with it. It was a primitive version of a crank trigger, but it actually did work fairly well. So I thought it was interesting that Oldsmobile actually pioneered the crank trigger that we see on pretty much everything nowadays. It was the experimental version of it. It did pan out and work pretty good, and actually most of the crank triggering systems on the newer vehicles are patterned after what Oldsmobile did. They're just a lot better. So the 350 was actually the strongest version of this small block with the early thicker block and good heads. The 403 was a decent engine, nothing wrong with it. It was just a little underpowered and kind of choked out with smog, and it was a block that didn't have as much rigidity in the main web area. But it's still, you know, honestly, I've never really seen one of those just blow up because they had too much power. I know people have modified them, put better heads on them, bigger camshafts, and run them pretty hard. And honestly, in my experience, I've never seen one of those really just blow up because the main webs gave away. So it is a decent engine. They were very smooth, very reliable, and you could modify them and make them into a very decent street engine. They all had 4 barrels. Every 403 was a quadrajet 4-barrel from the factory. Now in 1975's Oldsmobile, I mean this was in the midst of the gas crunch, Oldsmobile took this same small block V8 and they cast it with a little dinky 3.5-inch bore. And of course they retained the stroke, 3.385. This gave us the 260 Oldsmobile, 260 cubic inches, which was designed to be an economical V8. It had 110 horsepower and 205 foot-pounds of torque. So not a real powerhouse, but the 260 was known for its reliability, and it actually got pretty decent fuel economy. It was just your plain Jane run-of-the-mill small cubic inch V8, not something that you would want to build a hot rod out of. And this is one of the things that has happened over the years is people have purchased wrecking yard engines thinking, oh, it's a 350, but they didn't check that casting number, and it's actually a 260. And they ended up with a power plant that was pretty disappointing as far as power goes. However, it's like we've said before, not every engine has to be a performance engine. The 260 was a very, very reliable, smooth, solid solid engine, something to get you from point A to point B. It was definitely durable and strong. It just wasn't a real powerhouse. This was basically the only small block that had a 2-barrel on it. The rest of them all had 4 barrels from the factory. And the 260 was also used in some Buicks and Pontiacs in the mid to later 70s. In 1980, increased the bore of the 260 to 3-inch 800 thousandths and of course retained a 3.385 stroke to produce the 307 cubic inch Oldsmobile. Again, a lightened up block with thin main webs and smog era cylinder heads. They did all come with 4-barrel carburetors, which was a plus. The 307 was also a very reliable engine. Very solid, very reliable, had a little more power than the 260, but got about the same fuel economy. The 307 had 140 horsepower and 255 foot-pounds of torque, which made it definitely a step above the 260. And for a station wagon stock type, everyday plain Jane daily driver, it was perfectly fine. It was a very reliable, very durable power plant that earned a reputation for being smooth and just as dependable as the day is long. So it was a decent engine. Not a hot rod or high performance engine, just a durable engine for your daily driver. Believe it or not, they did make a high output version of the 307, which boasted 180 horsepower and 245 foot-pounds of torque, which was pretty good for 307 cubic inches. They actually put that in some of the heavier cars. It had a bigger camshaft, it had a better carburetor, it had a better intake manifold, had better heads on it, and it had a Y-pipe dual exhaust system. So it was definitely an upgrade from the lower version of the 307. But again, still not really a high-performance hot rod engine. In 1985, halfway through its production, because the 307 was 1980 to 1990, they actually upgraded the block and put a roller cam in it and full floating piston pins, which was a really good upgrade for this engine, and it made it even more reliable and more durable than the previous version. And it also increased the fuel economy of the engine by going to that roller cam. A lot less internal friction in the engine made it a better performer as far as miles per gallon goes. Along with the roller cam and the better induction system, it also had high swirl cylinder heads that had a more efficient combustion chamber and better flowing ports. That also helped the performance and the economy of the 307. The 307 was a popular engine with GM. It was used in Buick, Pontiacs, Cadillacs, even a Chevy Caprice station wagon in the mid-80s that got the Oldsmobile engine. By this time, GM had done a lot of the mixing and matching of engines. They kind of were melding the different divisions of GM together and saying, hey, we're going to share this stuff. A lot of the vehicles at that time, Pontiacs, Oldsmobile, Buicks, Cadillacs, also got the 305 cubic inch small block Chevrolet engine. That was also a thing that was an engine that was shared across the lines in those years. By 1990, the small block Oldsmobiles were done. It was the emissions era, it was the smog era, it was getting more and more difficult to meet the EPA standards, and Oldsmobile just went away from the second generation V8s altogether. Now there is a third generation. We got to touch on this a little bit. Another car with their third generation V8, which was actually a Cadillac engine. It was the 4-liter 244 cubic inch Northstar Cadillac engine, and it was available in the Oldsmobile Aurora. It had 250 horsepower and 260 foot-pounds of torque. It was an all-aluminum V8. The Northstar actually got a bad reputation in some of the Cadillacs, but it was actually a pretty decent engine as long as it didn't break down. The Aurora was actually a really, really nice car. In fact, one of the interesting stories about the Aurora is it was designed so well that GM had what they would do is they would build prototypes and then they would put them in a crusher to see how much pressure it took to crush the car from the top down, from front to back. The Aurora actually broke the GM car crusher. It was such a tough design, a well-designed vehicle, They actually had to use a crusher that was designed for bigger GMC trucks to crush that car and measure how much force it took to actually cause the body and the frame to cave in on that thing. So I thought that was pretty interesting. A very well-built car, well-designed, and it had decent power. A nice looking car also. In 2003, it was all but over for Oldsmobile. The last Oldsmobile ever built rolled off the line in April of 2003. It was an Oldsmobile Alero that actually went into a museum after that. And unfortunately, GM killed the Oldsmobile line of cars after that year, and it was all pretty much over. But Oldsmobile has a great history. They got a lot of really great engines. These engines have a lot of potential. They are very reliable, very powerful, and Oldsmobile, one of my personal favorite lines of cars and V8 engines, has a fantastic, rich history, and so definitely a topic that I am interested in. That's pretty much it for the Oldsmobile V8s and the Oldsmobile car company itself. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you will like and subscribe, make any comments. If you have any corrections, if you have anything that you want to like tweak or correct, no problem. I'm sure I got something wrong in here that somebody's going to point out, and that's fine. I have no problem with that. One thing that I would say though is one thing I'm seeing is I would ask you to do me a favor. If you have this compulsion or this desire to post comments on any of my videos that are political or that have anything to do with world events like what's going on in Israel and what's happening in the world, please don't do that. I'm getting guys on here that say, you know, I'm pro this country, I'm pro these people, and you know, Joe Biden and blah, 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 or Trump. Okay, this is not a political channel. I am not going to allow any discussions whatsoever of political things, world events. That's not what this channel is for. It is automotive related. It's actually my escape to get away from all the nonsense that's going on in the world. And so if you post anything like that, which a few of you have, some people have got on, and I don't know, they might be trolls, you're going to be deleted and banned. So please don't do that. If you have automotive related stuff, you want to talk about Oldsmobiles, you want to ask questions, you want to tell me that I'm wrong about something, no problem. Let's just keep it automotive related. So I appreciate you watching. Thank you very much. There's more coming. We're going to do Pontiac next. So I will talk to you very soon, I promise.